Genesis chapter 7. We had just finished with chapter 28, where Jacob has had the dream of Jacob's ladder, which is of course symbolic of the stone of destiny, the stone of scone. It was the dream where Jacob saw a ladder ascending from heaven, and angels descending and ascending to heaven, and the Lord standing over the ladder, which is of course symbolic of Jesus Christ. And this stone would be carried amongst the tribes of Israel for generations to come, until it ended up finally in Great Britain in the coronation chair, where it stayed for 700 or so years, until it was recently returned to Scotland a few years ago. But we're going to pick it up now in Genesis chapter 29 and verse 1. And before we do, let us go to the Father and petition Him in prayer for wisdom and understanding. Heavenly Father, we come before You this day, and we ask, Father, that You grant us understanding and wisdom, that You open the eyes and ears of all who study with us, that You reveal to us the truth, Father, from Your Word, which we seek, that You liberally poured it out, that we may partake of it, Father, as the fountains of living waters and as of the bread of life. And we ask these things in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. So Genesis chapter 29 and verse 1. Then Jacob went on his journey and came into the land of the people of the east. Verse 2. And he looked, and behold, a well in the field, and lo, there were 3 flocks of sheep lying by it. For out of the well they watered the flocks. And a great stone was upon the well's mouth. Verse 3. And thither were all the flocks gathered, and they rolled the stone from the well's mouth, and watered the sheep, and put the stone again upon the well's mouth in his place. Verse 4. And Jacob said unto them, My brethren, whence be ye? They said, Of Haran are we. Verse 5. And he said unto them, Know ye Laban the son of Nahor? And they said, We know him. Verse 6. And he said unto them, Is he well? And they said, He is well. And behold, Rachel his daughter cometh with the sheep. Verse 7. And he said, Lo, it is yet high day, neither is it time that the cattle should be gathered together. Water ye the sheep, and go feed them. Verse 8. And they said, We cannot, until all the flocks be gathered together, until they roll the stone from off the well's mouth, then will we water the sheep. Verse 9. And while he yet spake with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept for him. Verse 10. And it came to pass, when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near, and rolled the stone from the well's mouth, and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Verse 11. And Jacob kissed Rachel, and lifted up his voice, and wept. Verse 12. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's brother, and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. Verse 13. And it came to pass, when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran out to meet him, and embraced him, and kissed him, and brought him to his house. And he told Laban all these things. Verse 14. And Laban said unto him, Surely thou art bone and my flesh. Surely thou art my bone and my flesh. And he abode with him for the space of a month. In other words, for a moon. Verse 15. And Laban said unto Jacob, Because thou art my brother, shouldest thou serve me for naught? Tell me, what shall thy wages be? Verse 16. And Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Verse 17. Leah was tender-eyed, and Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. Verse 18. And Jacob loved Rachel, and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel thy younger daughter. Verse 19. And Laban said, It is better that I give her to thee, than that I should give her to another man. Abide with me. Verse 20. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days, for the love he had for her. Verse 21. And Jacob said unto Laban, Give me thy wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go in unto her. And of course we've already discussed what it means to go into a woman. Verse 23. And Laban gathered together all the men of the place, and made a feast. Verse 23. And it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah, his daughter, and brought her to him, and he went in unto her. No doubt it was dark, and he probably couldn't see. Verse 24. And Laban gave unto his daughter Leah Zilpah, his maid, for an handmaid. Verse 25. And it came to pass in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And he, meaning Jacob, said to Laban, What is this thou hast done unto me? Did I not serve thee for Rachel? Wherefore then hast thou beguiled me? In other words, why have you deceived me? Verse 26. And Laban said, It must not so be done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Verse 27. Fulfill her week, and we will give thee this also, for the service which thou shalt serve me yet 7 other years. And Jacob did so, and fulfilled her week, and gave him Rachel his daughter to wife also. Verse 29. And Laban gave to Rachel his daughter Bilhah, handmaid, to be her maid. In other words, he gave his daughter Bilhah to be her handmaid. Verse 30. And he went also in unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah. And he served with him yet 7 other years, in other words, with Laban. Verse 31. And the Lord saw that Leah was hated, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Verse 32. And Leah conceived and bare a son, and she called his name Reuben. She said, Surely the Lord hath looked upon my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. And of course Reuben means, behold, a son, or it's a boy. Verse 33. And she conceived again and bare a son, and said, Because the Lord had heard I was hated, he therefore hath given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon, which means heard or has heard. Verse 34. And she conceived again and bare a son, and said, Now this time my husband will be joined unto me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore was his name called Levi. And Levi means joined or joined together, and Levi would also be the priest line of the tribe of Judah, the Levitical priest line. Verse 35. And she conceived again and bare a son, and she said, Now will I be praised, or now will I praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah, which means praised. So right here in these last 2 sons, you've got the priest line, and you've got the king line of the tribe of Judah. And left bearing. In other words, and she left bearing. Verse 30. Or Genesis chapter 30 and verse 1. I don't know why I keep doing that. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. Verse 2. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, Am I in God's stead? In other words, am I in God's place, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? Verse 3. And she said, Behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, that she may bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. Verse 4. And she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife, and Jacob went in unto her, and Bilhah conceived, and bare Jacob a son. Verse 6. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. Dan, of course, means God is my judge. Verse 7. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again and bare a son, and bare Jacob a second son. Verse 8. And Rachel said, With great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali, which means my wrestlings. Verse 9. When Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah her maid, and gave unto Jacob to wife. Verse 10. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son. Verse 11. And Leah said, A troop cometh. And she called his name Gad. And Gad, of course, means a troop. Verse 12. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. Verse 13. And Leah said, Happy am I, for the daughters that will call me blessed. And she called his name Asher, which means happy. Verse 14. And Reuben went in the days of the wheat harvest, and found mandrakes in the field, and brought them unto his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, Give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes. Verse 15. And she said unto her, It is a small matter that thou hast taken my husband, and wouldest thou take also my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, Therefore he shall lie with me tonight for thy son's mandrakes. Verse 16. And Jacob came out of the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him, and said, Thou must come in unto me, for surely I have hired thee with my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night. Verse 17. And God hearkened unto Leah, and she conceived, and bare Jacob a fifth son. Verse 18. And Leah said, God hath given me a hire, because I have given my maiden to my husband, that she called his name Issachar, which means a hire or hireling. Verse 19. And Leah conceived again, and bare Jacob a sixth son. Verse 20. And Leah said, God hath endowed me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. And she called his name Zebulun, which means exalted. It also can mean other things. Verse 21. And afterwards she bare a daughter, and called her name Dinah. And Dinah means judgment or plea. Verse 22. And God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her, and opened her womb. Verse 23. And she conceived and bare a son, and saith, God hath taken away my reproach. Verse 24. And she called his name Joseph, and said, The Lord shall add to me another son. And of course, Joseph means fruitful. Verse 25. And it came to pass, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said unto Laban, Send me away, that I may go to my own place, to my own country. Verse 26. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served thee, and let me go, for thou knowest my service which I have done to thee. Verse 27. And Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry. For I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed thee, or blessed me for thy sake. Verse 28. And he said, appoint me thy wages, and I will give it. Verse 29. And he said unto him, thou knowest how that I have served thee, and how thy cattle was with me. Verse 30. For it was little which thou hadst before I came, and it is now increased into a multitude. And the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming. And now when I shall provide for mine, and now shall I provide for my own house also? Verse 31. And he said, what shall I give thee? In other words, Laban. And Jacob said, thou shalt not give me anything if thou wilt do this thing for me. I will again feed and keep thy flock. Verse 32. I will pass through all thy flock today, removing thence all the speckled and spotted cattle, and all the brown cattle among the sheep, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and of such shall be my hire. Verse 33. So shall my righteousness answer for me in time to come, when it shall come for me to hire before thy face. Or when it shall come for my hire before thy face. Everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and brown among the sheep, that shall be counted stolen with me. Or the word stolen here is not quite right. In other words, they shall be accounted as those you will give to me. Verse 34. And Laban said, behold, I would it might be according to thy word. Verse 35. And he removed the he-goats that were ring-straked and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had some white in it, and all the brown among the sheep, and gave them into the hands of his sons. Verse 36. And he set 3 days' journey betwixt himself and Jacob, and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. Verse 37. And Jacob took him rods of green poplar, and of hazel and chestnut tree, and peeled them white strakes in them, and made them white appear which was in the rods. In other words, he peeled them. Verse 38. And he set the rods which he had peeled before the flocks in the gutters and in the watering troughs, and the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink. In other words, he's using a little covert action here to make his sheep breed with Laban's sheep even more. Verse 39. And the flocks conceived before the rods, and brought forth cattle, and ring-strake, and speckled, and spotted. In other words, his plan had worked. Verse 40. And Jacob did separate the lambs, and set the faces of the flocks towards the ring-straked, and all the brown in the flock of Laban. And he put his own flocks by themselves, and put them not into Laban's cattle. In other words, he separated them. Verse 34. And it came to pass, whensoever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. In other words, he fenced them in, where the strong cattle could breed with his. Verse 42. And when the cattle were feeble, he put them not in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger were Jacob's. Again, he is the supplanter. But then again, Laban had tricked him a number of times, and this we have already covered as we were reading. Verse 43. And the man increased exceedingly, and had much cattle, and maidservants and menservants, and camels and asses. Genesis chapter 31. Yeah, what do you know? That time I didn't say verse. Genesis chapter 31 and verse 1. And he heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's, and all that which was our father's hath he gotten all this glory. Verse 2. And Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not towards him as before. In other words, Laban was now not quite pleased with Jacob, because Jacob had increased and Laban had decreased. Verse 3. And the Lord said unto Jacob, Return unto the land of thy fathers and of thy kindred, and I will be with thee. Verse 4. And Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field of unto his flock. Verse 5. And he said unto them, I see your father's countenance, that is not towards me as before. In other words, your father's not happy with me now. But the God of my father hath been with me. Verse 6. And ye know that with all my power I have served your father. In other words, I've done everything I could for him and been very loyal to him. Verse 7. For your father hath deceived me, and changed my wages 10 times, but God suffered him not to hurt me. Verse 8. If he said thus, The speckled shall be thy wages, then all the cattle that bear speckled. And if he said thus, that the ring-straked shall be thy hire, then all the cattle bear ring-straked. Verse 9. Thus God hath taken away the cattle of your father, and given them to me. Verse 10. And it came to pass, at the time that the cattle conceived, that I lifted up my eyes, and saw a dream. And behold, the rams which were leaped upon the cattle were ring-straked, speckled, and gristled. Verse 11. And the angel of God spake unto me in a dream, saying, Jacob. And I said, Here am I. Verse 12. And he said, Lift up thine eyes and see all the rams which leap upon the cattle that are ring-straked, speckled, and gristled. For I have seen all that Laban doeth unto thee. Verse 13. I am the God of Bethel, in other words, the house of God, where thou anointedest the pillar, and where thou vowedest a vow unto me. Now arise, and get thee from this land, and return into the land of thy kindred. In other words, go back to the land of Canaan. Verse 14. And Rachel and Leah answered unto him, Is there any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Verse 15. Are we not counted of him as strangers? For he has sold us, and hath quite devoured also all our money. Verse 16. For all the riches which God hath taken from our father, that is ours, and our children's. Now then, whatsoever hath God said unto thee, do. Verse 17. And Jacob rose up, and set his sons and his wives upon camels. Verse 18. And he carried away all his cattle and all his goods which he had gotten, the cattle of his getting. In other words, the cattle that he had raised, which he had gotten in Padanaram, for to go to Isaac his father in the land of Canaan. Verse 19. And Laban went to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. In other words, his gods, his idols. Verse 20. And Jacob stole away unawares to Laban the Syrian, in that he told him not that he fled. In other words, he did not tell him he was leaving. Verse 21. So he fled with all he had, he rose up and passed over the river and set his face toward the Mount of Gilead, or Mount Gilead, verse 22. And it was told to Laban on the third day that Jacob was fled. Verse 23. And he took his brethren with him and pursued after him 7 days' journey. And they overtook him in the Mount Gilead. Verse 24. And God came unto Laban the Syrian in a dream by night, and said unto him, Take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. In other words, don't you say anything amiss to him. Verse 25. And Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mount, and Laban and his brethren pitched in the Mount of Gilead. Verse 26. And Laban said unto Jacob, What hast thou done, that thou hast stolen away the daughter, that thou hast stolen away unawares to me, and carried away my daughters as captives with thee with the sword? Which he didn't really do it with the sword, but Laban's implying that he did. Laban kind of pushing the envelope of what God had told him not to do here. Verse 27. Wherefore didst thou flee away secretly and steal away from me, and didst not tell me, that I might have sent thee away with mirth, and with songs, and tabret, and with harp? Verse 28. And hast suffered me not to kiss my sons and daughters. Thou hast done foolishly in so doing. Verse 29. It is in the power of my hand to do you hurt. But the God of your father spake unto me yesternight, saying, Take heed, thou speakest not to Jacob either good or bad. Verse 30. And now, though thou wouldest needs be gone, because thou sore longest after thy father's house, yet wherefore hast thou stolen my gods? Verse 31. Now Jacob is unaware of this. And Jacob answered and said unto Laban, Because I was afraid, for I said, Peradventure, or suppose thou would take us by force thy daughters from me. Verse 32. With whomsoever thou findest thy gods, let him not live. Wherefore, or before our brethren, discern thou what is thine with me, and take it to thee. For Jacob knew not that Rachel had stolen them. In other words, if you find them here amongst us, then let the person that took them be killed. And if you find them here, take them back with you. Again, Jacob was unaware that Rachel had taken them. Verse 33. And Laban went to Jacob's tent, or went into Jacob's tent, and into Leah's tent, and into the two maidservants' tents, but he found them not. Then he went into Leah's tent, and entered into Rachel's, or then he went out of Leah's tent, and entered into Rachel's tent. Verse 34. Now Rachel had taken the images, and put them in the camel's furniture, and sat upon them. And Laban searched all the tent, but found them not. Verse 35. And she said to her father, Let it not displease my lord, that I cannot rise up before thee, for the custom of women is upon me. In other words, I am in my menstrual cycle. I'm on my period. And he searched, but found not the images. Verse 36. And Jacob was wroth, and chode with Laban. In other words, argued or had disagreement with Laban. And Jacob answered and said unto Laban, What is my trespass? What is my sin, that thou hast hotly pursued after me? Verse 37. Wherefore hast thou searched all of my stuff? What hast thou found of all thy household stuff? In other words, have you found any of your images here? Set it here before my brethren and thy brethren, that they may judge betwixt us both. In other words, if you found anything, then set it out here, so that your brethren and my brethren can be witnesses between us. Verse 38. This 20 years have I been with thee. Thy ewes and thy goats have not cast their young, and the rams of thy flock have I not eaten. In other words, Jacob had eaten his own. Verse 39. And that which was torn of beasts I brought not unto thee, I bear the loss of it. In other words, anything that was killed, Jacob bore the loss. And of my hand didst thou require it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. In other words, even though Jacob had not brought him anything that was torn or killed by beasts, Laban required it, or required payment thereof for it. Verse 40. Thus I was in the day, and drought consumed, and in frost by night, and my sleep departed from my eyes. In other words, I worked very hard for you. Verse 41. Thus have I been 20 years in thine house. I served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, and 6 years for thy cattle. And thou hast changed my wages 10 times. Verse 42. Except the God of my father, and the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had been with me, surely thou hadst sent me away now empty. God has seen my affliction and the labor of my hands, and rebuked thee yesternight. Verse 49. Or verse 43. And Laban answered and said unto Jacob, These daughters are my daughters, and these children are my children. In other words, my grandchildren. And these cattle are my cattle, and all that thou seest is mine. And what can I do to thee unto these my daughters, or unto the children which they have borne? In other words, he's saying, these are bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, and what can I do to them? They're my daughters and my own grandchildren. Verse 34. Now therefore come, let us make a covenant, or an agreement, I and thou, and let it be for a witness between me and thee. Verse 45. And Jacob took up a stone and set it up for a pillar. Verse 46. And Jacob said unto his brethren, Gather stones. And they took stones and made an heap. And they did eat there upon the heap. Verse 47. And Laban called it Jagar Sahadutha. But Jacob called it Galeed. Now, both of these words mean witness heap. One, no doubt, in Hebrew and one in Syrian. Or Syriac tongue. Verse 48. And Laban said, This heap is a witness between me and thee this day. Therefore is the name of it called Galeed. Verse 49. And Mizpah, for he said, The Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent from one another. Verse 50. If thou shalt afflict my daughters, or if thou shalt take other wives beside my daughters, no man is with us. See, God is witness betwixt me and thee. Verse 51. And Laban said unto Jacob, Behold this heap, and behold the pillar, which I have cast betwixt me and thee. Verse 52. This heap be a witness, and this pillar be a witness, that I will not pass over this heap unto thee, or to thee, and thou shalt not pass over this heap and this pillar to me for harm. In other words, there will be no troubles between us. You will not pass over the pillar to do me harm, and I will not pass over the pillar to do you harm. Verse 53. And the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor and the God of their father judge betwixt us. And Jacob sware by the fear of his father Isaac. In other words, by the reverence of his father Isaac. Verse 54. Then Jacob offered a sacrifice upon the mount, and called unto his brethren to eat bread, And they did eat bread and tarried all night in the mount. Verse 55. And early in the morning Laban rose up and kissed his sons and daughters and blessed them. And Laban returned into his place. Genesis, verse 32. Well, I did it again. Genesis chapter 32. And Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. Verse 2. And Jacob saw them, and he said, This is God's host. And he called the name of the camp Mahanaim, which means two camps or dual camps. Verse 3. And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir, in the country of Edom. In other words, you've read of Mount Seir a number of times, the land of the Edomites, the offspring of Edom, the offspring of Esau. Verse 4. And he commanded them, saying, Thus shall ye speak unto my lord Esau. Thy servant Jacob saith thus, I have sojourned with Laban, and stayed there until now. Verse 5. And I have oxen and asses and flocks and men servants and women servants, and I have sent to tell thee, my lord, that I might find grace in thy sight. Verse 6. And the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, We came to thy brother Esau, and he also cometh to meet thee, and 400 men with him. Verse 7. And Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided his people with him, and the flocks, and the herds, and the camels into two bands. In other words, into two camps. Verse 8. And said, If Esau come to the one company, and smite it, then the other company which is left shall escape. Verse 9. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, the Lord which saidest unto me, Return unto thy country, and unto thy kindred, and I will deal with thee. Verse 10. I am not worthy of the least of these mercies, and of all truth, which thou hast showed unto thy servant. For with my staff have I passed over this Jordan, and now am become two bands. Now you've got a type here. This is Jacob, who would become Israel. And he will become Israel very shortly here, as named by God. And he's passed over the Jordan and has become two bands. Now I want you to think about what happens in the future of Israel, where Israel crosses over the Jordan after the time of the Exodus, and becomes two kingdoms. You've got a type here. Verse 11. Deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he will come and smite me, and the mother of with the children. In other words, and my wives and children. Verse 12. And thou saidest, I will surely do thee good, and make thy seed as the sand of sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Verse 13. And he lodged there that night, and took of that which came to his hand a present for Esau his brother. Verse 14. 200 she-goats, and 20 he-goats, and 200 ewes, and 20 rams. Verse 15. 30 milk camels with their colts, 40 kine, which means cattle, 10 bulls, 20 she-asses, and 10 foals. Verse 16. And he delivered them into the hands of his servants, every drove by themselves. In other words, the word drove here is flock. And he said unto his servants, Pass over before me, and put a space betwixt drove and drove. In other words, put a space between each flock of all these animals. Verse 17. And he commanded the foremost, saying, When Esau my brother meeteth thee, and asketh thee, saying, Whose art thou, and whither goest thou? And whose are these before thee? Verse 18. Then thou shalt say, They be thy servants Jacob's. It is a present sent unto my lord Esau, and behold, he is also behind us. Verse 19. And so commanded he the second, and the third, and all that followed the droves, the flocks, saying, On this manner shall ye speak to Esau when ye find him. Verse 20. And say moreover, Behold, thy servant Jacob is behind us. For he said, I will appease him with the present that goeth before me. And afterward I will see his face, peradventure, in other words, in supposing he will accept me. Verse 20. So went the present over before him, and himself lodged the night in the company. Verse 22. And he rose up that night, and took his 2 wives, and his 2 women servants, and his 11 sons, and passed over the ford Jabbok. Verse 23. And he took them, and sent them over the brook, and set over that he had. Verse 24. And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of day. And of course, this man that wrestled with him will be the angel of the Lord. And again, you see it's written as man here. Verse 25. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh. In other words, this he is the angel of the Lord, and he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh. And the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. Verse 26. And he, speaking the angel of the Lord, said, Let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. Verse 27. And he said unto him, What is thy name? And he said, Jacob. Verse 28. And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince thou hast power with God, and with men, and hast prevailed. So you see the connotation here of what the name Israel means. It means the prince that prevails with God, the prince that has power with God. But without God he has no power, and he will not prevail. Verse 29. And Jacob asked him and said, Tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, Wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name? And he blessed him there. In other words, you know who I am, Jacob. Why are you asking who I am? Verse 30. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen the face, or God, I have seen God face to face, and my life was preserved. Peniel, of course, means the face of God. And it was a belief at this time that if you looked upon God, you would surely die. Verse 31. And as he passed over Peniel, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. In other words, he limped. Verse 34, or verse 32. Therefore the children of Israel eat now the sinew which shrank, which is upon the hollow of the thigh unto this day, because he touched of the hollow of Jacob's thigh in the sinew that shrank. Chapter 33 and verse 1. And Jacob lifted up his eyes, and looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men. And he divided the children unto Leah, and unto Rachel, and unto the 2 handmaids. Verse 2. And he put the handmaids and their children foremost, and Leah and her children after, and Rachel and Joseph hindermost. Verse 3. And he passed over them, and bowed himself to the ground 7 times, until he came to his brother. Verse 4. And Esau ran to meet him, and embraced him, and fell on his neck, and kissed him. And they wept. For all the bad Esau was, he still knew his family, and time heals all wounds, and Esau had forgotten or forgiven him for stealing his birthright. Verse 5. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the women and the children, and said, Who are those with thee? And he said, These are the children which God hath graciously given thy servant. Verse 6. Then the handmaidens came near, they and their children, and they bowed themselves. Verse 7. And Leah also with her children came near and bowed themselves. And after came Joseph near, and Rachel, and they bowed themselves. Verse 8. And he said, What meanest thou by all this drove which I met? And he said, These are to find grace in the sight of my Lord. In other words, this is Jacob answering Esau. Verse 9. And Esau said, I have enough, my brother. Keep that which thou hast unto thyself. Verse 10. And Jacob said, Nay, I pray thee, if now I have found grace in thy sight, then receive my present at my hand. Therefore I have seen thy face as though it had been the face of God, and thou wast pleased with me. Verse 11. Take, I pray thee, my blessing that is brought to thee, because God hath dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough. And he urged him, and he took it. Verse 12. And he said, Let us go, take our journey, let us go, and I will go before thee. Verse 13. And he said unto him, My Lord knoweth that the children are tender, and that the flocks of the herds with young ones are with me. And if men should overdrive them one day, all the flock will die. Verse 14. Let my Lord, I pray thee, pass before his servant, and I will lead on softly, or in other words, slowly, according to as the cattle that goeth before me, and the children be able to endure, until I come unto the Lord, or unto my Lord, unto Seir. In other words, Esau's land. Verse 15. And Esau said, Let me now leave thee some of the folk that are with me. And he said, What needeth it? Let me find grace in the sight of my Lord. Verse 16. And Esau returned that day on his way unto Seir. Verse 17. And Jacob journeyed to Succoth, and built there him an house, and made booths for his cattle. Therefore came the name of this place Succoth. Verse 18. And Jacob came to Shalem, a city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he had came from Padan Aram, and pitched his tent before the city. Verse 19. And he brought a parcel of a field where he had spread his tent, at the hand of the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. Verse 20. And he erected there an altar, and called it Elilo Hel Israel, which means the mighty God of Israel. Genesis 34 and verse 1. And Dinah, the daughter of Leah, which she bare unto Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. Verse 2. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the country, saw her, he took her and lay with her and defiled her. In other words, basically, he raped her. Verse 23. And his soul clave unto Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the damsel, and spake kindly unto the damsel. Verse 4. And Shechem spake unto his father Hamor, saying, Get me this damsel to wife. Verse 5. And Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah his daughter. Now his sons were with the cattle in the field, and Jacob held his peace until they were come. Verse 6. And Hamor the father of Shechem went out to Jacob to commune with him. Verse 7. And the sons of Jacob came out of the field. When they heard it, the men were grieved, and they were very wroth, in other words, angry, because he had wrought folly in Israel in lying with Jacob's daughter, which thing ought not to be done. In other words, because this person is not of the kinsfolk, he is of the strangers. Verse 8. And Hamor communed with them, saying, The soul of my son Shechem longeth for your daughter. I pray you give him to her to wife. Verse 9. And make ye marriages with us, and give your daughters unto us, and take to our daughters unto you. Verse 10. And ye shall dwell with us, and the land before you. Dwell and trade ye therein, and get you possessions therein. Verse 11. And Shechem said unto her father, and to her brethren, Let me find grace in your eyes, and what ye shall say unto me will I give. Verse 12. Ask me never so much dowry, a gift, and I will give according to ye say unto me, but give me the damsel to wife. Verse 13. And the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and Hamor his father deceitfully, and said, Because he has defiled Dinah their sister. Verse 14. And they said unto him, We cannot do this thing, to give our sister to the one that is uncircumcised, for that were a reproach unto us. Verse 15. But we will consent unto you, if you will be as we, and every male of you be circumcised. Verse 16. Then we will give our daughters unto you, and will take your daughters to us, and we will dwell with you, and we will become one people. Now, this is not what's going to happen. Actually, the sons of Jacob are setting these people up. Verse 17. But if you will not hearken to us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and we will be gone. Verse 18. And their words pleased Hamor and Shechem, Hamor's son. Verse 19. And the young man deferred not to do the thing, because he had delight in Jacob's daughter. In other words, he did not refuse to do the thing, because he had delight in Jacob's daughter. For he was more honorable than the house of his father. Verse 20. And Hamor and Shechem, his son, came into the gate into the city, and communed with the men in their city, saying, verse 21, These men are peaceable with us, therefore let them dwell in the land and trade therein, for the land, behold, it is large enough for them. And let us take to their daughters to us for wives, and let us give them our daughters. Verse 22. Only herein the men consent unto us to dwell with us, to be one people, if every male among us be circumcised as they are circumcised. Verse 23. Shall not the cattle of their substance and every beast of theirs be ours? Only let us consent unto them, and they will dwell with us. In other words, they're going to make us rich. Verse 24. And unto Hamor and unto Shechem his son hearkened all that went out of the gate of the city. And every male was circumcised, all that went out of the gate of his city. Verse 25. And it came to pass on the third day, they were sore. In other words, they were sore after that circumcision. And the two sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brethren, took each man, in other words, each one of them took a sword, and came into the city boldly, and slew all the males. Verse 26. And they slew Hamor and Shechem, the son, with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah out of Shechem's house, and went out. Verse 27. And the sons of Jacob came upon the slain, and spoiled the city, because they had defiled their sister. Verse 28. And they took their sheep and their oxen and their asses, and that which was in the city, and that which was in the field, verse 29, and all of their wealth, and all of their little ones, and took their wives captive, and spoiled even all that was in the house. Verse 30. And Jacob said unto Simeon and Levi, Ye have troubled me to make me a stink among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and I, being few in number, they shall gather themselves together against me and slay me, and I shall be destroyed, I and my house. Verse 31. And they said, Should he deal with our sister as an harlot? In other words, should we have allowed this? Now I think this is a fairly good place to stop for today. We've covered quite a few chapters here. As always, brothers and sisters in Christ, it is my prayer for you that you will study our Father's Word diligently, that you will seek answers from our Father and not pay attention to the worldly, because the world will lead you astray, whereas the Word of God is true and does not waver. It is misunderstood oftentimes because people don't take the time to study it properly, but it does not waver, and it holds deeper truths for all. It holds many treasures. So then, if you study to show yourself approved before the Lord, and always ask His blessing, and always ask for wisdom and revelation from Him, He will surely give it as He has promised. May God bless you in your studies as you seek His face and counsel. Thank you for listening. This has been Just Thoughts.